This is the Equity in Action presentation presented by Kimberly McNeely and Brian Oakes from the City of Austin. This session qualifies for 0.1 CEUs. In order to receive continuing education credit, attendees must watch the entirety of the video. After completion of the video, attendees should exit out of the video and return to the session home screen. Click on Evaluate Session, complete the session evaluation, and then follow the instructions to complete CEU verification. This includes contact information, a question about the session, and an affidavit confirming you did attend this session.
Parks and recreational spaces are key to creating community. Green spaces where people can gather, natural places for all walks of life to enjoy, activity fields to keep us active, sports courts to keep us playing, cultural facilities to celebrate our art and explore our history, recreational and senior centers to provide community programs, support, and a place to make friends. These all contribute positively to one's quality of life. However, sometimes this concept is taken for granted.
Hi everyone, I'm Brian Oakes, the Chief Equity Officer for the City of Austin. Resource allocation, program offerings, and community-centered design has historically benefited only part of the community and left out individuals of color. It's time for us to get comfortable with stepping into the discomfort of tackling our history. Systemic racism has been baked into many institutions, including the Parks and Recreation system. But I'm pleased to know that there is a commitment from so many Parks and Recreation professionals to make a lasting change and reverse these inequities. Our Austin Parks and Recreation Department has made that commitment.
Hi, I'm Kimberly McNeely, and I serve as the City of Austin Parks and Recreation Director. Today, we'd like to take you on a journey of discovery as it relates to race and park systems, and we'd like to use Austin as an example. It's our hope that you will see how to explore indicators and disparities associated with social and racial equity from a historical perspective. Learn about specific strategies to analyze equity within an agency and experience, through Austin's implementation, strategies used to advance social equity and race equity.
And it is our hope that as you acknowledge your agency's history and recognize disparities, you will be able to implement specific strategies unique to your department to make lasting advancement towards racial equity.
While Austin is often viewed as a progressive city supporting social reform, equality, human rights, and the like, it is not always and does not always live up to this reputation. Austin has a history of promoting institutional racism through policy and planning, which has had a lasting impact. As an example, in the early 1900s, developers implemented segregationist practices. Here's how it happened.
The racial divide in Austin used to look a lot different than it does today. After the Civil War, Austin was seen as sort of a refuge for freed slaves, safe from most of the racial violence that plagued the South. By 1880, the city's African American population lived in pockets spread throughout the city. It was as geographically integrated as Austin has ever been. In 1928, a new city plan was put in place. The Supreme Court had ruled that explicit zoning laws pushing segregation were unconstitutional. So the city leaders got a little creative. If you were an African American and wanted access to public services like schools and parks, you had to live in a so-called Negro district, newly formed on the east side of town. By 1940, you can see how the once dispersed African American population had become concentrated in one area. A few years later, the segregation was cemented. The federal government, in an effort to build wealth following the Depression, began backing mortgage loans. But they wouldn't back these mortgage loans in certain high-risk neighborhoods that were redlined. Minority neighborhoods were virtually always redlined. The effect was that African Americans were left on the outside of what would become one of the largest wealth drivers in U.S. history. Fast forward to now. Austin's population has boomed since the 1970s. The region's development has swept away many of the historically black schools, neighborhoods, and business centers that served as cultural anchors for the community. Rising property values and taxes have forced many African American families to seek more affordable housing in the suburbs. Left with a smaller percentage of black residents in the city, the ties between Austin's African American minority and its Anglo majority have weakened. There are efforts by some in the African American community to rebuild these business and cultural institutions. But reforging the connections requires work from both sides of the racial divide. Without a proactive and concerted effort to reintegrate, Austin will do little more than maintain its divided status quo.
The development of Hyde Park neighborhood is a striking example of these practices in play. According to A History of Austin's Housing Segregation, compiled by the University of Texas lecturer Elliot Treader, the Hyde Park neighborhood established a racially separated precedent for development in the city. Ads touted Hyde Park as, quote, free from nuisances and an objectionable class of people, proper restrictions being taken to guard against undesirable occupants, end quote. Today, the Hyde Park's neighborhood's racial diversity is disproportionately represented by whites. The Hyde Park neighborhood's racial diversity is as follows: 78% white, 13% Hispanic, and 4% Asian, 2% African American, 2% two or more races, and 1% American Indian or Alaskan Native.
The Hyde Park neighborhood is an example of how those planning decisions made almost a century ago have lasting impacts today.
One of the biggest obstructions to me is I-35. I call it the Red Sea. It takes an act of God to cross it.
In the late 1920s, the city council decided that we're going to pass an ordinance that every person of African descent who desires to have water, if you wanted to have utilities, you had to move to East Austin.
If you bought a house in a quote-unquote white neighborhood, they wouldn't turn the electricity on.
When we first got here, we learned that incinerators were in the East Austin area. The airport was in the East Austin area.
The dirty industries were relegated to those same neighborhoods.
But then we built up our own nice community.
My sense of community in East Austin was strong because I went to church here, I went to school here.
We managed to make our own environment. But now it too has proven to be desirable, and people are now moving in droves.
The price for raw land has gotten expensive, for existing houses has gotten expensive.
When we say we don't mind sharing, we didn't mean come in and move everybody out.
Out of what were our neighborhoods.
When you have somebody walk across the street and say to your face, we saved this neighborhood. That's like me walking in your house and saying to you, I don't like your drapes.
Once folks have crossed that Red Sea, they're increasingly comfortable on this side.
If you don't know the history, you may repeat it. And a lot of that history has been ugly to us as a community, as an East Austin neighborhood.
As part of a New Deal in the mid-1930s, a policy to rebuild wealth during the Great Depression was contrived. The federal government started backing low-cost mortgages and refinance loans to promote and preserve home ownership. The plan jump-started one of the largest accumulations of citizen wealth in the nation's history, an effort that not only rebuilt wealth at the time, but laid the foundation for decades of benefits that accrued through generations of white homeowners. The same policies excluded minority neighborhoods. Simply put, while most Americans gained equity in new homes or upgraded the value of their existing houses, the Black population saw a racial wedge driven deeper between white affluence and Black poverty.
As if the aforementioned policy and planning decisions had not done enough to divide Austin, the I-35 construction of the 1950s and 60s further solidified the divide between the city's downtown core and the Negro district of East Austin, as it was historically called. The highway, a permanent, physical, and symbolic barrier that keeps the city segregated still today. The 1928 plan, neighborhood developments, redlining, and the physical barrier of I-35 all directly impacted the development of the Austin Park system. The Parks and Recreation Department was also established in 1928.
The 1928 citywide plan established boundaries, zoning recommendations, and the drawings of streets and subdivisions. The plan also extensively covered proposed ideas for parks and recreational facilities in Austin. It made a broad statement that emphasized the importance and role of parks, justified the need for the public sector involvement and investment, and called for the development of a citywide park system. It also integrated recommendations to include the segregation of park facilities through the construction of a separate quote-unquote Negro neighborhood park in East Austin. Many of the parks we have today are thanks to this master plan.
It is important to note, while this presentation has chronicled the Black community's experience, Austin also had segregated neighborhoods and parks for other minority groups.
Parque Zaragoza was referred to as quote-unquote Mexican Park in most newspaper articles and early park documents. When the park system started, there were citywide sports tournaments. Different parks played each other. But Rosewood and Parque Zaragoza were not allowed to play with the White Parks teams until 1963. The Austin Parks and Recreation system was shaped by this institutionalized racism. In 1944, the Doris Miller Auditorium was built. The building hosted Black World War II servicemen from various Central Texas bases for dances and entertainment organized by the USO. After the war, the building functioned as a rec center, and it also became a stop on the Chitlin Circuit, where Black performers felt it was safe to play during segregation. The building was named after Doris "Dory" Miller, a Waco native serviceman who was the first African American to be awarded the Navy Cross for his heroic actions during the attack on Pearl Harbor.
I'm here at the Rosewood Neighborhood Park, and at the time, this park was named the Rosewood Avenue Park and Playground for the Colored. It was established in 1929, and that's just 1 year after the 1928 plan. It eventually included a segregated swimming pool, park, outdoor bandstand, sports fields, and a recreation center. Today, this building hosts Notes for Notes, which is a recording studio, summer camp, basketball, theater classes, and it has a community rental space. While the park is beloved by all Austinites, there's no denying that this park, inclusive of its traditional and new amenities, is treasured by the Black community. Recent plans to improve aquatic facilities throughout Austin reminded the Parks and Recreation Department of the city's history of segregation, and it motivated the department to consider equity in its path forward with pools.
As you know, in the early to mid-1930s, many cities across the country benefited from the New Deal. In many places, the federally funded Works Progress Administration went to work building swimming pools.
A number of swimming pools built in minority communities within the Austin Park system were built during the New Deal era. Despite the video depiction, this federal support was not evenly felt, nor was the support equitably distributed. These federal resources often reinforced segregation as local officials made investment decisions that had a disproportionately negative impact on communities of color, while enhancing resources available to white residents.
Furthermore, there is some evidence that pool designs in minority neighborhoods were not built as deep as they were in white neighborhoods, with the consequence of minimizing one's ability to learn to swim. The space became more of a wading pool. Several of the pool designs within minority communities reflect the wading pool model. It's not just perception. Professor Jeff Wiltz, author of Contested Waters, A Social History of Swimming Pools in America, outlines the history of segregation and discrimination that contributes to this disproportionality today. The 1930s U.S. New Deal built around 2,000 municipal pools, mostly in white neighborhoods. The pools were segregated, and black people across the nation were denied access to most pools.
Some aquatic spaces within Austin cannot be replicated because of the natural elements that contribute to the space. One of those spaces is Austin's iconic Barton Springs. This space, however, was not always able to be enjoyed by every community member.
Spring of 60, I went to Austin High, and the principal called me in and said, I consider you to be the leader of the black kids in your class, so I want you to go and tell them none of you can go to the senior picnic because Barton Springs and Zilka Park are segregated. We did petitions, and many parents signed, and students themselves. I think they eventually said, well, you can go to the picnic, but they weren't going to change the policy forever. They were just saying, oh, let them go. It's just 8. Barton Springs is iconic. Barton Springs is Austin. Even though I had never been there, everybody talked about it all the time. We had to do the pool. They didn't really have it properly locked off. You just go around this way and you're in. You know how big Barton Springs is. How do you control all the people in there? So we started swimming. They really don't know at first. Then they'll notice, oh, there's some black kids in there. They want to take us out. Then we go around, catch our breaths, and come back again. That summer was full of swim-ins. We did a lot of ins. And this was happening, it was spreading like wildfire across the country. Eventually, they changed the city ordinance. I found that almost everything that opened, we had to march, protest, petition, go to the council. These things just don't open by themselves.
As a department director, I may not be responsible for the 1928 plan, for redlining, for the New Deal construction decisions, for segregationist policies, or for the statistical consequences of the past decisions. But I feel very much responsible, and I feel very obligated to reverse the disparities and the disproportionality that impacts people of color within my community, within the Austin community.
Stopping point.
Hello, Traps friends. It's me, Kimberly McNeely, here with you in person, sort of, virtually. I just want to take a little time to talk to you about the previous section. And the information that you received in the previous section was a lot about Austin's history. And it had a lot of lasting impacts on the city of Austin and on the Parks and Recreation Department. And it's really part of what made us want to put equity in action here at the Parks and Recreation Department. We explored our history by reviewing documents that we might have found at the History Center or at our local library. We reviewed our history and learned about our history by tuning in to podcasts and broadcasts by our local PBS station. But the thing that was really, really powerful for us is being able to interview individuals who had that lived experience, individuals who were actually living through segregationist policies, who actually felt unwanted or felt as though they were not able to go at certain places throughout the city of Austin, and specifically certain places within the Parks and Recreation Department. And it was through those testimonials that we really learned about how that kind of decision-making from the city really had powerful impacts on the Parks and Recreation Department, who was really falling in line with policies that were made by elected officials or other city leadership, but inadvertently really didn't allow individuals that we would want to have embraced within our community to use our facilities. And so as a public servant, I really encourage you to ask yourself, in the history of your city where you live, were there policies or practices that happened a long time ago that are now having lasting impacts on the way people view or even utilize the services within the city? And also, as a recreation professional, I ask you to dig a little bit deeper, and I encourage you to think about if there's anything in your department's history, specifically in your department's history, that might have unsuspectingly or unintentionally created inequities in the way that you're able to provide services and opportunities today.
The history of the City of Austin Equity Office and our work around using equity assessment tools through an equity assessment process really date back to the year 2015 in our city. And it was a really pivotal year for us because in 2015, Austin was recognized as the most family-friendly city in the United States. But at the same time, we were made aware that the disparities in childhood poverty for us was monumental. For example, Black and Latino children that live in our city are 5 and 7 times more likely to live in poverty compared to white children in our city. So it really pushed the question of truly, were we really the most family-friendly city in the United States, given the racial inequities that we saw not only in childhood poverty, but across many different quality of life indicators for our city. As I always tell the story, I like to say that we had community organizations and community leaders who were really just fed up and really approached our council to begin to have some real conversations around this issue of equity, but how as a city could we make better decisions as we related to using what we call an equity lens. How do we really sort of account for all of the communities and the populations that historically had been left behind in our decision-making as a city? And that led our city council to adopt a resolution which actually directed our city manager to develop and begin to implement equity assessment process across all of our city departments. And as I came to Austin in 2016 as the city's first chief equity officer, that's what our office set out to do. We actually spent our first year in working with community through a co-creative process to really build and design the city's first equity assessment tool. And we did that process through really sitting down with community leaders and asking them questions around what were the pain points that you had in terms of how you engaged and interacted with our city. And a lot of the feedback that we got was they wanted the city to better design programs that actually met the needs of their communities. They wanted us to really sort of commit ourselves as a city to this sort of co-creative design process in terms of how we do community engagement. They also wanted to sort of better understand, I would say, get under the hood of the car to see how we function or operate as a city and how we make the decisions in sort of key areas that actually impact equity at the end of the day. And that was really sort of the foundation or the catalyst that allowed us to begin to build our first version of the equity assessment tool.
At the completion of the assessment, there were details that related to the following recommendations. Know the history. Consider historical context of projects. Does the project address events that have negatively impacted communities of color? Acknowledge them and create space for communities to share as to not repeat the same mistakes. Review and monitor the data. What are the data and projected impacts of the project? What does the data tell us? Is it disaggregated by race and ethnicity? Engage the community. How have communities been engaged? Are there opportunities to expand engagement? And what were the efforts to reach the most marginalized populations and bring those voices into consideration? Advance racial equity. Does this project have an opportunity to advance equity and reduce or eliminate a disparity? Analyze unintended consequences. Are there any possible unintended outcomes for this project? Could the project have a negative impact on communities of color and/or other marginalized populations?
In this next portion of our Equity in Action presentation, you are going to hear from some local community members about their recent past experiences up to now, and you're going to hear about how they've been able to engage with aquatics facilities and services and how those experiences may or may not have been equitable.
There's a whole lot of structured family life related to pools in Austin. I mean, you can't underestimate that, because it's not just babysitting. The whole family gets involved in what happens with swimming. Every time I took a flyer into any one of these AISD schools, I ran into some of the staff people. And at the staff people level, I would invariably, what I would always say, wow, you opened up a new pool? Yeah, I can take my family over there. I can tell, I'm talking about staff, multi-racial staff, all of the staff members' eyes just lit up immediately because they knew that those pools were magnets for the entire family to get involved. And for me, that was just real uplifting. That's what I think where the hope is.
Hi, my name is Paula Rojas, and I'm a mother of two kids who are now 11 and 16. But this started maybe in 2014 was when I first started trying to get involved to get my kids swim lessons. I'm an immigrant. My parents don't know how to swim. I can defend myself in the water, I can get around, but I don't know the strokes or any of those things at all. I've never learned those formally. And so when I had kids, I really wanted them to know how to swim well. It was a priority for me as a parent. And one of my kids has a heart condition, and so she can't do lots of other things, but swimming was something that we were told by the cardiologist was good for her. So that's why I had like swimming on the brain for years, So I tried to sign her up for swim lessons, maybe starting 2014. She was 10 at the time. And this was at the Govalle pool. And we were all excited. I registered, I did the whole thing. And then right before it started, I was told that the lessons were being canceled because of unenrollment. That series wasn't going to happen. But that I could go somewhere else to a different pool to take her. And I just had limited transportation options at the time, and I couldn't actually do it, so we didn't do it. I tried again the following year, but this time I went in person to aquatics to sign up because I really wanted to understand what was going on. And they told me that the issue was that when it's getting close to the date, if there's not enough kids, they cancel because of under enrollment, right? But it wasn't yet the deadline. I was like, but why do you cancel even before deadlines? Why don't, maybe people need more time to be able to register. They said, well, because we have to figure out the staffing ahead of time. And they said that they also look at patterns from past years. That's when I thought, hey, there needs to be more done around this. And I did go and meet with aquatics. I think they had some meeting for parents. where I did show up once, and I have to say I didn't have a good experience. It was one of these like intentional meetings of getting families involved, and it was all white parents, except for me, and they were all people that knew a lot about what was happening in the swim stuff, and they were kind of like trying to figure things out. And I was like, wait a minute, we're just trying to even get a team and we're having trouble with that. And these were people who'd been kind of in it a lot longer. I remember feeling really frustrated, really like the questions didn't even speak to the issues I came to talk about. They were talking about other things, about how they were lining it up for, the meets and things like that, where we were just trying to get our first step in the door. And I didn't feel that the staff there that day was very in tune with the fact that that I had other issues that I thought were important. So I left actually pretty upset. I remember now that meeting. But there were other people in the Parks Department and in aquatics who were very, who intentionally reached out to me and to the other families, and kind of realized that there was a dynamic there too. So I think there was like a low grade kind of racial dynamic in aquatics at the time, where everybody there was white. And when I went, I know, and all the staff, at every level, and it really didn't feel like a place that would be open to other folks, to people of color in particular, and I'm an English speaking, college educated, light skinned Latina. Like, if I don't feel uncomfortable, I was thinking, what about other families who actually would have a harder time participating? At the time, what I felt was there was a particular culture in aquatics that wasn't very kind of inviting or welcoming to everybody. It was a very white space. The staff was all white that I saw, both older and younger folks, the families that participated. Also, they seem to all be in on something that's been going on for a really long time. They all know each other. The location of the aquatics office, it's way over there on the west side. And so I really was worried about how would this be for other families to kind of connect to. I didn't feel that about PART in general, but it was something about aquatics. And it felt like it's always the same people, the same families for years and years, and they have these swim teams and they do really well and they know each other, and it's a culture, So I felt like I was kind of butting into that culture.
What inequities does Paula's experience address? How can your department ensure that your spaces and resources are inclusive to everyone?
Growing up there, we didn't have a rec, and so we would go to other ones, and other pools. When you're little, you don't notice the things as much, but we definitely didn't go to Barton Springs. And even like now, I have a 17-year-old daughter who likes to go to Zilker with her little friends, and my mom is like, right? Like, she's like, what are you doing letting her go over there? Worried about her, because that's not something that we did. And my mom felt like, she need to be careful over there. She's never said that about her going to like Rosewood or, going to Givens or something like that. My mom did the swim classes for me. So my mom's from San Marcos, and her father passed away, and he drowned in the colored pool. It was for the Black folks and the brown folks. At the time, they didn't get to go to the actual pools. It was really like a swimming hole. And so, yeah, she tried to make sure that I knew how to swim. I have a giant knot on my forehead from when I was like 5 years old. I dove into the baby swimming pool at the shallow pool at Garrison. Yeah. And my mom didn't do the YMCA. She did not believe in that. She did the rec center. She always was like rec center type of person.
How can one's experience with historically exclusive park spaces impact their feelings and interactions with the park system? How can your department address past decisions that have impacted access and opportunities in the park systems for communities of color?
I grew up in Las Dimas, which the closest pool for us at the time was Barton Springs, and then later I think Dottie Jordan came online. So we had a nice big municipal pool and then a smaller neighborhood pool, but it was still across a highway, and now it's a major highway now. Um, and growing up, since my mom worked for the department, I was always involved in summer camps. And so that was where my big part of being exposed to swimming lessons came when I did summer camps. I distinctly remember taking lessons at Bartholomew Pool. And then later on, my sister and I were 10 years apart. Since my mom didn't know how to swim, I took her to the mommy and me swim classes. So it's like then I got like another uh, extra swimming lessons with taking, exposing my sister and taking my sister. But then, growing up, both my mom didn't swim, but my dad was a swimmer. But my only experience going swimming with my dad was in lakes and open water, because him growing up in Austin, that was the best access that he had getting to was just going to the creek and swimming in creeks and swimming in lakes. So that's big part of his water exposure, and that's how I got exposed to water really early on as a kid, is just going fishing with him and being at the lake. And then the structural programs, once, I became old enough to take swimming lessons and go to summer camp, is when I started, formally learning how to swim.
How can an experience like Tiffany's exposure to swim lessons through summer camps impact your planning decisions? What opportunities can your department provide through intentional programming to raise equity in communities of color?
Some parents will tell me, you know, uh, Hassan, he's so excited that y'all are going to Barton Springs because we just don't go there. We just don't go there. And he loves when you take him there, when y'all go to Barton Springs to go swimming, you know? And so I make sure that we try to visit more far out than like at Dove. How lucky are we now? We got a pool, right? We get to walk, few steps and we're right there at the pool. But I make sure that we visit lots of pools during the summer so that they can see the difference. And it's just so important because we just tend to not leave our area.
How can we provide opportunities for communities of color to explore and discover all of our park system?
People was not getting informed of these programs, right? That was basically our job, kind of get to the people to know about this and to do all these surveys and go outreach to the people and talk to the people and ask them questions. So the city developed some questions and I was the one that went and talked to them on the pools, different pools, not only Montopolis. I was talking to Montopolis, Rosewood, on the top of my head, most of Southeast pools. Most of these Southeast pools are mostly Latinos and blacks, depending on the neighborhood. And when I talk to the Latino families that goes to these pools, they definitely was like, I don't speak English, no inglés. And I was like, okay, then I just started talking in English, in Spanish. Part of the issue was that it was the information is there, but the ways or the means of like getting it was interrupted because definitely language barriers. But there were some that they were interested in their kids to learn how to swim because that's also a thing that a lot of these kids don't know. They just learn how to, but they don't have like an instruction. They don't have anything. They just learn on the go, like I did, like probably a lot of people did, and and they recommended me a lot of good ideas, like go to social medias, go to like radio stations, go to kind of like, I guess, have more advocacy in getting the word out. Like there are some Latino radio stations that it's just like a little space, you know, be like, hey, just so you know, we have these programs, but in Spanish, so that they can get to the Latino community as well. That is really big in Austin. So it is definitely that. It's just getting the word out there, and then having more advocacy to get the information in the places that these people consume information as well.
What inequities does the Spanish speaking community face, and how can your department help address those? How does Simone's experience with community engagement relate to analyzing inequities? The lasting impact of historical policy and planning decisions cannot be overemphasized. According to the USA Swimming Foundation and the University of Memphis, 64% of Black children cannot swim. According to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the fatal drowning rate of African American children aged 5 to 14 is 3 times that of white children. A USA Swimming Foundation study shows that if a parent does not know how to swim, there's only a 13% chance that their child will learn how to swim.
All of this information up to this point set the stage for understanding how policy decisions and planning decisions of the past created inequities within the Austin Parks and Recreation Department. History matters. Historical decisions have impacted Austin's aquatics.
Stopping point.
Hey there, it's me again. I hope you're learning a few things about equity in action that you'll be able to use as part of your Parks and Recreation system. Now I want to talk a little bit about practical strategies to analyze equity within your park system. I would ask you to ask yourself a couple of questions. The first question being, how does your department engage users and non-users within the park system? Because that information can tell you a lot. For the city of Austin, we were able to hire someone named Simone, who you met previously, and Simone was able to engage individuals both as Spanish speakers and as English speakers and find out what it was about the park system that made people want to come and enjoy the space, and what was it about our park system, specifically aquatics, that maybe was a barrier to them. I think it would be important for you to ask yourself, how do you review data? Are you just using national statistic information, or are you using some more local information? For us in the Austin Parks and Recreation System, we not only took a look at that national data that we were able to share with you, but we also took a look at some pattern information that we found via our registrations and via our use patterns at our swimming pools. That was more localized, and it was part of the bigger picture. You might want to ask yourself, what can be done to improve access and opportunities that might lead to increased equity? And so for us in Austin, we thought about, wouldn't it be important or wouldn't we be able to provide more access if we allowed summer camp opportunities to expose children to aquatics facilities? So take them to multiple locations to be able to experience different kinds of swimming pools, maybe add swimming lessons to the already existing summer camp. So you sign up for summer camp, you automatically get swimming lessons. Those are just things to think about. And then lastly, I would say, I would think about the unintended consequences that when you're collecting all of the data and maybe you're just looking at one little piece of data, you might be not being able to see the bigger picture. So if I can go back to that example about data, if I just took a look at just the national data and I didn't take a look at the pattern information, I wouldn't come to understand that maybe the issue is not about the actual swimming pool, but maybe the barrier or the idea is I'm not offering the swimming lessons at the right time, or I'm not offering swim team at a time when people can come, or maybe my registration process is a little bit mixed up and it's making it more difficult for people to sign up. we have to look at everything in totality to be able to come up with an idea of how you might be able to advance equity. The strategy is not just, there's 4 different strategies that I gave you, but you might want to use them all in totality to be able to make this really work well for you.
Swim safe is really important for many different reasons, but drowning is the #1 cause of death in children under 4. Children under 15, I believe, drowning is in the top 3 in unintentional causes of death. And it really, statistics show it affects minorities more than it does anybody else. As an employee coming into the city of Austin, I had a general idea of why we got loads of lifeguards to work in West Austin. And I had a general idea of why couldn't we get lifeguards to come work at some of our East Austin pools. When you've got 15, 16, 17-year-olds who don't know how to swim, they're not going to be lifeguards for you, chances are, unless they manage to find a program like Swim ATX, where somebody is able to and willing to teach them to swim and show them that they can do it. And in a lot of cases, we found out that they hadn't grown up coming to the pool, either because their parents hadn't come to the pool or it wasn't important to them. Or I've met a lot of lifeguards who are there learning to swim or learning to become lifeguards because their parents grew up afraid of the water, not having access to it. And so, if we've got a few people coming to us whose parents are afraid, there's probably, and what we found is there's a lot more people out there that if we can get out there and teach them how to do it, they want to be a lifeguard. As the city starts to build more facilities, we're able to start offering more programs. And so Swim Safe has really kind of expanded across East Austin, and transportation is sometimes an issue for these kids. And so a lot of these kids are already making it to the rec center for camps, or they've been coming to the rec center for after school or while their parents are gone. And so we get the rec centers to help sign those kids up, and then those rec centers help the kids come out to the pool. And so Swim Safe and kind of expanding into East Austin with as much, free and subsidized swim lessons as possible really helps us in the long run to have more lifeguards that operate our facilities and that represent the neighborhoods that those pools are in, which has been a goal for us for a little bit. But it's a challenge, and it's definitely a work in progress.
Okay, well, I'd like to tell you about the how we got to this point with the neglect of our swimming pools in Austin. Started in 1928, the city had a master plan which said that the city needed parks, pools, and other infrastructure type items, water, electricity. And they said that, you could live in Austin as a minority, but if you wanted services, you had to move to the east side of town. And so with that, they built 2 swimming pools. One was Rosewood Pool, which was referred to as the Negro Pool. And then they had Parque Zaragoza, which was referred to as the Mexican Pool. And so they said, those are your 2 pools, and that's where you can swim. Okay, now, fast forward to desegregation back in the 60s and 70s, where minorities started swimming at other pools. Well, what this did is the Caucasians then started building their own private pools and private country clubs, and they stopped funding pools altogether, okay, or at least took some money away from pools, and so that started to degrade the infrastructure of the pools, and that took its toll on them as well. I can remember, and this is very true. I've been doing this job for a long time. I started back in 1985, and I've been swimming at the pool since 1971. So, you know, when leaders would ask us, when a pool would go down or something, there would be an issue with the pool. If it was in East Austin, it wasn't that big a deal, you know, because, well, nobody swims there anyway, you know. Some of the things that I heard, I don't even, wouldn't even want to say. But in reality, if it was a West Austin pool, that's where all the city council people lived. And I actually grew up in that area, so I knew of a lot of them. And those pools, they had to get fixed right away. They had to, they got the priority. They got the lifeguard staffing. I want to say possibly the hours might have been different of operation, okay, because of popularity and how many people used them. So that is a sad part of our pool system, but we don't do that anymore. We serve every pool equally these days, and that's the outcome of this whole process, is that we divide finances equally to all sides of town and services to all sides of town.
By exploring indicators of disparities from a historical perspective, the Aquatics Division has been able to recognize its own shortcomings to begin the process of furthering equity in historically impacted communities. How will your department decide to move forward after researching and reviewing the impact of your city's and department's historical decisions?
My Park, My Pool, My City is it's a collaboration of 3 performances over 3 years. And it's in conjunction, a collaboration with Forklift Dance Works and the City of Austin Parks and Recreation Department's Aquatic Division. And it was made to highlight the inequalities between the East Austin pools and other pools throughout the city, with the infrastructure falling apart and being neglected over time.
Over the course of 3 yearly performances from 2015 to 2018, My Pool, My Parks, My City brought together both community members and aquatic staff to tell the stories of these pools. Paul has acted in all 3 of the performances.
Forklift uses art, culture to expose people to everyday routine activities that nobody thought art could connect to. People don't realize all the work that city workers do, especially the PARD staff. So to see what they do with limited resources and then to get this encouragement from Forklift makes it a beautiful experience. Hopefully what Forklift can do is create an awareness for the citizens to say, hey, this is what's going on, and the need is great in terms of providing services so that people can still enjoy the pools. It takes getting involved. Your voice does make a difference. Quit sitting at the house, get up, put your suit on, get your little floppy hat, go swim.
Working with the community was, it was so great. I met so many people that, I didn't know, and to hear their stories about why these pools are so important to them really made my job mean something. And, now I don't just go to pools and say, hey, look, I'm going to go fix this pool today. Now I'm going to go fix this pool for Joe, for constable, for the constable, for all Ophelia, for all the people that swim at that particular pool, because I've gotten to know them now. They're like family. What were the tangible outcomes of these shows, of the performance? It's not just about a performance. These performances tell stories. And with those stories, you can have outcomes. And a big outcome for us was, financially, okay? You got to look at it like that sometimes. And we had a guy from the budget office that attended one of our performances, and he comes to us afterwards and says, hey, I know how we can increase your budget. And he came up with an idea, and it increased our budget by, I want to say, $1.2 million. And that was added to our annual maintenance budget. And so that allowed us to do preventative maintenance projects that we hadn't been able to do in the past. Okay, it allowed us to not stress so much about, pick and choose project. We were able to do the projects that we always wanted to do. Another thing is in 2018, there was a bond process that happened. And at first we were asking for $16 million. And we have to think that because of these performances and because we were able to tell these stories, that we had the largest aquatic bond ever at $40 million. And I believe the Parks and Rec Department got a nice bond increase because of that also. So there are some tangible outcomes that do come from these performances. So that's important to know if you're looking to do a similar type situation, that there are definitely positive outcomes that can come from this.
Using the equity assessment, the Parks and Recreation Department determined decision-making opportunities to influence improved racial equity outcomes. It helped my department become conscious of historical choices, and it helped us avoid repeating the past and make room for new possibilities. Equity assessment concepts. Planning. What do we change and prioritize in programming to further equity? Practices. What routines, habits, or expectations need to change or be established to further equity? Personnel. Who do we hire, retain, promote, or develop as leaders to further equity? Policy. What do we propose to modify to further equity? Budget. What items do we need to add or cut, or what initiatives need to be funded to further equity?
Since 2014, the department's thought process was to decrease the number of assets in the system and even consider replacing traditional pools with other aquatic features like splash pads. Prior to 2014, a number of swimming pools in communities of color had already been decommissioned. In 2014, 2015, and 2016, the department had written memos and reports that recommended pool closures and budget cuts associated with aquatics. Much of the rationale related to general attendance and programming registration. Guess which communities had the lower attendance and lower registration numbers? The department was heading down a path of repeating the past. PARD had not yet finished the equity assessment. But then,
thanks to the Austin community, the department had an awakening as it related to swimming pools. The community engagement and advocacy compelled the department to discard the previous conventional thinking. Instead of pushing forward with closure and replacement policies, PARD took a step back to consider community perspective and history. The result? A 2018 council-approved aquatics vision plan that revised the closure recommendations. The department now realizes, although I'm not sure it fully understood at the time, the original plan would have assuredly had unintended consequences. The original closure and replacement plan would have been a repeat of past decision-making that disproportionately impacted communities of color. The Parks and Recreation Department, at the insistence of and the advocacy from the community, made the case that all swimming pools within its inventory, that's 35, were to have the necessary repairs to remain open. This included 7 pools that were considered in critical condition in 2014. Critical condition meant that there was the possibility of failure within 5 years.
The community communicated to the council that department budget allocations for the aquatics division need to be commensurate with the documented repair and preventative maintenance needs. The community advocacy resulted in a robust 2018 bond program for the Parks and Recreation Department Aquatics Division, an increase to the Aquatics Operational General Fund budget, one-time capital allocations for specific council-approved projects, Council approved $40 million to aquatics capital improvements of an estimated $124 million to renovate the entire system and build 4 new pools. $6 million to replace Givens Pool in a historically black community. $13 million to build a pool in the Colony Park neighborhood in a black and Latinx community. $21 million to system-wide renovations. Approximately 43% of the aquatic assets are in communities of color, not including natural bodies of water. Over the past 2 years, the Parks and Recreation Department has invested about 50% of the past 2 years' system-wide capital improvement allocation in these assets. While $21 million is generous, the resources do not allow for every identified repair to be made. When making system-wide investment decisions, assuming safety is not the driving factor, PARD asks the following questions to ensure equity is top of mind as it relates to investments. Is there a logical connection between the investment and improving equity in at least one council outcome? How does the investment impact historic and systemic racial inequities? Does the investment address inequities validated by racial disparity data? Have communities of color been engaged actively and effectively about the investment? Stopping point.
So glad to see you again. Thanks for joining us. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the previous section where we talked about equity assessment concepts. We asked a series of questions and I want to answer those questions for you. There was a question about planning. So for the Austin Parks and Recreation Department, when we think about planning, we think about how are we planning our programs? Are we offering our programs at the right time of day? Are we offering them on the right day of the week? Are we offering the right programs in the right community? And we had to make some changes to how we planned for being able to serve the community, offering programs at days and times and the type of program that people actually wanted to participate in. We had to ask ourselves questions about practices, right? It's traditional that we have a registration process. All of us do that, but that practice wasn't practical, right? It didn't work for our community. And so therefore we were perpetuating the idea that people weren't learning how to swim. So the Austin Parks and Recreation Department changed their practice and decided to offer drop-in swim programs. And this allowed people to be able to learn to swim at a higher rate. And then we asked ourselves about personnel. We found out that our community wasn't really connecting to swimming pools. And in some cases, it was because the individuals working there were not reflective of the community in which they lived. So we started the Swim ATX program to be able to train and hire lifeguards that looked like the community in which they worked. And therefore, we broke down a barrier where people felt more welcome coming to the swimming pool. And we had to ask ourselves the question about policy. Did our policies perpetuate some of the bad decisions of the past? And the answer was yes, because we were originally going to close swimming pools. We were saying it wasn't financially responsible to keep them open. But after speaking to a number of community members and learning a little bit more about the history, we decided to reverse that policy and instead problem solve and come up with a way to actually keep swimming pools open for everybody. And then we had to ask our question about budget. Are we putting enough money towards this particular aquatics goal of ours to be able to make it as accessible as possible? Is there enough money in the budget? Are we able to fund things the way that we should? And the answer to the question is maybe we might have to move some money around. We might have to advocate for additional funding for the general fund to make sure that we're maintaining our pools. And thankfully, through the advocacy of the community, that actually happened. And even more, we were able to get additional funds in our capital improvement program via bonds because our elected officials listened to the community and the community said, please fix all of our swimming pools, renovate them, make them usable. And hey, guess what? In areas where there isn't access, please build us one. And that we were able to make that happen. It's my hope that today you were able to learn a bunch of things about equity and that some of these will be very useful to you in bringing equity to your community. The Austin Parks and Recreation Department's equity journey is not yet complete. It will always be a work in progress. The entire city of Austin, including this department, continues to work to overcome the 1928 plan's legacy of segregation and inequity. The work is necessary and difficult and cathartic, and it happens with the support of the Equity Office, the work associated with the City of Austin Equity Assessment, and a committed Parks and Recreation Department team. Thank you for joining us today. If you'd like more information about Austin's Equity in Action journey, please feel free to email me. And from me to you, be safe, stay well, and like we love to say here in Austin in our Parks and Recreation Department, go forth and create community.